Alright, so we're going to continue with the systems of speech production in this lecture. If you recall, in your part 1 of the systems in speech production, we briefly talked about the respiratory system. And I had mentioned in that lecture that if you have not had a chance, or if you're not in my anatomy and physiology class, if you contact me, I can give you in-depth information about the respiratory system. In this lecture, I've covered very briefly about the respiratory system. And the important reason to cover the respiratory system as part of our speech production system is we need the source or the air supply from our lungs in order to initiate sound source, which is where the phonatory system comes into play. Okay, so the phonatory system is the conversion of sound source to audible vibrations for speech. Meaning, if you remember, if you recall, I've reiterated this in a couple of lectures, is if I had the respiratory system and I had the phonatory system, I did not have my head on top. If I just took my head and kept it away, all I had was my respiratory system and my phonatory system, the larynx. When the air comes from the lungs at the level of the larynx, all I can hear is the sound. Bzz, bzz, bzz. Okay. So basically, the phonatory system converts the sound source air into audible vibrations for speech, and those audible vibrations are this: bzz, bzz, bzz. In order to achieve that, we need something called the larynx, which houses our vocal folds, which is what vibrates to produce that sound. Now, is that our only reason that we have the larynx? Is that our primary function of the larynx? No. The primary biological function of the larynx is actually to protect the lungs from foreign bodies. So for example, if you know there is a threat to your breathing system or your respiratory system, you think a dust or some foreign body is going to go, the first thing your body does is goes, it does that to expel that thing out, right? So coughing is a reflex that happens, that gets out your foreign body and prevent. For example, even if you try to choke, if food goes through the wrong pipe, so you have your esophagus that is posterior to your windpipe, which is where your trachea, right? So sometimes it just happens if you're eating too fast or something happens, or if we choke, it might, instead of going into the esophagus, the food might come in the wrong side, and that's again when you cough. So it becomes a protection for the lungs from foreign bodies. The other key thing is breathing, right? You need to be able to breathe in and out. So your vocal folds open and slightly closed, but your vocal folds have to remain completely open when you're breathing. Okay. And this also, if you think about this, it helps us in lifting something that's called the Valsalva maneuver of the phonatory system, is when you are able to bear down to lift heavy things or push against a wall. Anything that, when you're trying to do an exercise, you're trying to lift weights, you have to kind of build pressure at the level of your vocal folds to support the lifting. And so the larynx also aids in that. The final thing that is important for us is phonation, right? Speech is probably just an overlaid function of all of this. It becomes a non-biological function of the larynx. So for us, the focus of our understanding is how do we understand the phonatory system, which helps us in speech production. Okay, so we're going to talk about the larynx, we're going to talk about the structures in the larynx, we're going to talk about some of the muscles in the larynx and the physiology of the larynx and how it aids in speech production. Okay, so if you recall, the larynx is located right above the trachea. So let me pull up a picture. What you see right here is your trachea. Okay, this structure that you see above, starting from here through down here, this structure is called your larynx. Okay, so it's located right above the trachea. It's in the anterior portion of your neck. If you remember what anterior and posterior is, anterior is towards the front, right? So it's located in the anterior portion of your neck, and its position is the level of the C3. So C1 is your atlas, C2 is your axis. It's at the position of C3 to C7 of the cervical vertebra. So if you remember the vertebral column, we talked about the first 7 cervical vertebrae, right? And so now the larynx is housed between C3 and C7 typically. It can change with age, with gender. It can also change depending on the activity that you do. So for example, if you swallow, your larynx actually elevates high up in the neck, so that position then may change when compared to when at rest. Okay, so the larynx is located in the anterior portion of your neck between the C3 and C7 vertebrae, and it's housed right above the trachea or your respiratory system. Okay. Now, when we talk about the framework of the larynx, we talked about the skeletal framework of the respiratory system, right? Now, the skeletal framework or the laryngeal framework of the phonatory system involves a bone, the only bone which from where the larynx suspends, it's your hyoid bone. Okay, it's a horseshoe-shaped bone. So if you see right here, this is your hyoid bone. It's a horseshoe-shaped bone. This is where the larynx suspends from. Okay, this is the only bone in the body that is not attached to any other bone. It is held in place by ligaments and membranes or muscles. Okay. So the only bone I said is a hyoid. The rest of the larynx is a cartilaginous structure, and it supports the muscles and phonation. So what are the different cartilages involved in our in our phonatory system? Is the thyroid, the cricoid, and the arytenoids. Okay. The thyroid and the cricoid are unpaired cartilaginous, meaning there is only one cartilage that forms the thyroid and the cricoid in your laryngeal system, and your arytenoids are paired cartilages. So just let's take a look at your thyroid, your arytenoid, and your cricoid cartilage. Okay, so this is a lateral view, meaning you're viewing the larynx from the side. What do I see? I see the hyoid bone, a horseshoe-shaped bone. That's the only bone from where the larynx suspends, right? What you see right here is your thyroid cartilage only from the lateral view. This, what you see, is your cricoid cartilage, and you cannot see the arytenoid cartilage, and I will show another view of the arytenoid cartilage in just a minute. Okay. All right. So this is the hyoid. This is your thyroid. This portion that you see is the lamina of the thyroid cartilage. This is cricoid, the lateral arch of your cricoid cartilage. Okay. Now, the thyroid and the cricoid are unpaired cartilaginous, meaning there's only a single cartilage. If you see what is right here is a laryngeal prominence, also called as the Adam's apple, seen more common in men. So if you touch your neck and if you see a prominence right there, that becomes your Adam's apple or laryngeal prominence. Why is this important? Because from inside the laryngeal prominence or the thyroid notch is where your vocal folds attach. Okay. All right. So let me just show the arytenoids quickly. What you see right here in the posterior view, meaning from the back, if you view the larynx, what you see right here is your arytenoid cartilages, where you'll see some muscles, and your vocal folds are attached to the vocal process of the arytenoid cartilage. Okay, so let's talk about the thyroid cartilage. As I said, the thyroid is an unpaired cartilage. It's the largest cartilage, and some people say it forms like a shield of your larynx. Okay, it is the anterior aspect of the laryngeal framework. If you see the location, it's located superior. This is the cricoid, so it's located superior to the cricoid cartilage. Okay. What are some of the other structures? I talked about the Adam's apple or the laryngeal prominence. It serves as a protector to the vocal folds. Okay. Now, the one thing that I want to show right here is hang on. Okay, so you see how the attachments are. So your thyroid cartilage is attached to your hyoid bone through the thyrohyoid ligament, with the horns of your hyoid and your thyroid are articulating. Similarly, there is an articulation between your cricoid and your thyroid cartilage. Okay. Now, there are two joints that's important in the laryngeal system, and here let's just talk about the cricothyroid joint because we're talking about the cricoid and thyroid cartilage. The cricothyroid cartilage, cricothyroid joint is right here, which aids in the movement of the larynx, especially your thyroid cartilage, forward, kind of stretching the vocal folds. Okay, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that when we talk about the physiology. Okay. Your cricoid cartilage is also an unpaired cartilage. It attaches to the thyroid and the arytenoids. Okay. It forms the base of the larynx. When I say base of the larynx, if you see right immediately below your cricoid are your tracheal rings. So that's the end. This is where your larynx ends. Okay, right below that is your trachea, which is the windpipe. Now, the cricoid cartilage articulates with the trachea by means of a cricotracheal membrane right there. Okay. Also, an important thing to note about the cricoid is that the cricoid is the only complete cartilaginous ring in the respiratory passageway. Okay, so if you remember when I talked about the trachea, I said the trachea is closed in the front and open in the back. Right? Now, if you look at the cricoid is the only one that's complete. It's narrow in the posterior end. It's narrow in the anterior end and broader in the posterior end. And that is the only complete cartilaginous ring in the respiratory passageway. The posterior aspect is the one that is attached to the arytenoid. So let's see what I want to show here. If you look at the anterior part, that's narrow. The posterior part is broad. And I'll show you the posterior view of the cricoid. This thing right here, that is the cricoid cartilage. That's called the posterior quadrate lamina of the cricoid cartilage. And how you can see the arytenoids are attached to the posterior aspect of the cricoid cartilage. Okay? All right. I know these are a lot of anatomy terms that's thrown to you. Most of you are in my anatomy class, so if you get to see those lectures, you will understand in-depth information about all of these structures. I also have a model that I've shown in my anatomy class. For those that are only in my speech science class, if you will email me, I can give you access to that link that will help you view the lecture. Okay? All right. The next cartilage, which is a paired cartilage, is the arytenoids. Now, if I talk about the vocal folds, which are those pearly white structures, the anterior aspect of the vocal folds is attached to behind where the thyroid prominence or the thyroid laryngeal prominence or the thyroid notch is. And the posterior aspect is attached to the arytenoid cartilage. Okay, there are two processes to the arytenoid cartilage: a vocal process and a muscular process. Okay, the vocal process is where the vocal folds are attached, the posterior aspect of the vocal folds. The muscular process of the arytenoid serves as an attachment to a lot of the muscles, intrinsic laryngeal muscles. Okay. The arytenoids, when they try to come to midline, they will close the vocal folds, which aids in adduction, ADD, adduction, or bringing of the vocal folds together. Okay. So the laryngeal framework so far, we talked about the hyoid bone, the only bone from where the larynx suspends. Then we talked about the three cartilages that are important to understand how the laryngeal framework will help us in getting the vocal folds together or in pitch manipulations. So three cartilages were the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage, and the arytenoid cartilage. The thyroid and the cricoid cartilages are the unpaired cartilages. Okay. And the cricoid cartilage is the only the only complete cartilaginous ring that sits above the trachea. The trachea, if you remember, is open posteriorly and it's closed anteriorly, allowing for expansion and contraction of the trachea for the air to pass through. Okay. The arytenoids are the only paired cartilages, and they form the posterior attachments of the vocal folds. The arytenoids will aid in bringing the vocal folds together, adduction, meaning it will help to close the vocal folds to produce sounds. Right? Now, I'm going to talk about some laryngeal musculature here. The intrinsic laryngeal muscles, there are two kinds of muscles. Let me back up here. There are two kinds of muscles. There are extrinsic laryngeal muscles and intrinsic laryngeal muscles. Extrinsic laryngeal muscles are muscles that have a point of attachment within the larynx and another point of attachment outside the larynx. An intrinsic laryngeal muscle has both of its point of attachments within the larynx. The important aspect of the intrinsic laryngeal muscle is it governs the vocal fold action, meaning it is involved in fine-tuning movements of the vocal folds. So if it brings the vocal folds together, if it moves the vocal folds apart, if it raises the pitch or decreases the pitch, those are fine laryngeal movements that helps us with our voice quality, with the way our voice is unique from other people. That is what the intrinsic laryngeal muscles do. Okay. While the extrinsic laryngeal muscles holds the larynx in position in the neck, whether it's high up in the neck or whether it's low in the neck, that is controlled by the extrinsic laryngeal muscles. Now, the intrinsic laryngeal muscles can be divided based on their function. That's what I'm going to talk about here. If they are muscles that open up the vocal folds, if there are muscles that close the vocal folds, if there are muscles that increase the length and tension of the vocal folds, or if there are muscles that decrease the length and tension of the vocal folds. Okay. So the first muscle that I'm going to talk about is an abductor. Abductor, meaning it opens the vocal folds. It moves the vocal fold apart. It is important because this is the muscle that helps us with the respiration as well, because our vocal folds have to stay apart. So we need the abductors to keep the vocal folds apart. The two times that the vocal folds are apart is when you're breathing and when you want to stop phonation or stop talking, when you want to terminate phonation, then you use the abductors. There is only one intrinsic laryngeal muscle that's an abductor, which is called the posterior cricoarytenoid. So if you think about this, posterior is in the back, cricoid is a cricoid cartilage, arytenoid is another cartilage. So this is the muscle that runs in the posterior aspect of the cricoid and connects the cricoid to the arytenoid. If you look at it right here, is the posterior cricoarytenoid. It is in the posterior aspect of the cricoid, courses up and backwards, and it goes and inserts into the muscular process of the arytenoid cartilage. Okay, that's the PCA, and that's the only abductor that opens up the vocal folds. All right. The next function of the intrinsic laryngeal muscles is to bring the vocal folds together. Adductors or adductors, bringing the vocal folds together, which is called adduction. So ADD, meaning add, meaning bring the vocal folds together. Adduction of the vocal folds. The primary adductors are the LCA, lateral cricoarytenoid, and the interarytenoids. So if you look at the names, lateral is on the side, cricoid is a cricoid cartilage, arytenoid is arytenoid cartilage. So it originates from the lateral part of the cricoid cartilage and it goes up and inserts into the muscular process of the arytenoid cartilage. While the interarytenoids, as the name says, is between the arytenoids. It goes from one arytenoid to the other. And there are two parts to the interarytenoids. It's a transverse and oblique. So let's go back and look at the lateral cricoarytenoids first. Okay. So what you see right here is a lateral cricoarytenoid. It starts in the lateral aspect of the cricoid cartilage, courses up and backwards and obliquely, and it goes and attaches to the muscular process of the arytenoid cartilage. Okay. Now, if we talk about the interarytenoids right here, if you view in the posterior aspect, those are the interarytenoids. You have a transverse arytenoid that runs across the arytenoids and the oblique arytenoid that goes diagonally about the transverse arytenoid. Both of these muscles, the interarytenoids, oblique and transverse, and the lateral cricoarytenoids, when they contract, they bring the vocal folds together, adduction, aiding in vibration or phonation of the vocal folds. Okay. It also is needed to coughing. I have to bring those adductors together to cough. All right. The next function that we talk about is the tensor, meaning it aids in vocal fold tension. It increases the length of the vocal fold. All right. The only muscle that is supplied. Okay, let's come back to that. Hang on, don't think about it. I'll just talk about the cricothyroid now. Cricothyroid is a muscle that aids in increasing the vocal fold tension. If you recall, I talked about the cricothyroid joint a little while ago, and I said it aids in increasing the tension of the vocal folds. In addition to the cricothyroid joint, the cricothyroid muscle, CT, also involves increasing the tension of the vocal fold. So if I were to show you where CT is, cricothyroid, as the name says, it's between the cricoid cartilage and the thyroid cartilage. There are two parts to the cricothyroid as well, the pars oblique and the pars recta. These are two muscles. So, and the cricothyroid joint is right here. So the cricothyroid joint and the cricothyroid muscle aids in pulling the thyroid forward. It kind of rocks the thyroid forward when it contracts, increasing the tension of the vocal folds, because the vocal folds, remember, they're attached to this position right here where the thyroid notch is, and it goes back and courses to the posterior aspect of the vocal process of the arytenoids. Okay. The other muscle that involves in increasing the tension of the vocal folds is the thyroarytenoids, TA. It has two parts, the thyrovocalis and the thyromuscularis. The thyrovocalis muscle is a muscle that helps in tensing the vocal folds when it co-contracts with the cricothyroid. When I say co-contraction, meaning the cricothyroid and the thyrovocalis contract at the exact same time, that is called co-contraction, and will aid in increasing the tension of the vocal folds. Now, if the thyrovocalis contracts by itself, meaning it does not contract with the cricothyroid, then the thyrovocalis muscle will be actually also trying to bring the vocal folds together. Okay, the thyromuscularis, on the other hand, is a relaxer, meaning it shortens the vocal folds and decreases the pitch. So when I say tensor, anytime the cricothyroid contracts, it increases the pitch of the vocal folds. So if I go ah, that is the function of the cricothyroid joint and the cricothyroid muscle. But if I go that is a function of the thyromuscularis muscle. As the name says, the thyroarytenoids are a connection between the thyroid cartilage and the arytenoid cartilage. And that is exactly how there is coursing of the vocal folds from the thyroid cartilage to the arytenoid cartilage. Okay. So now that was in sum about the intrinsic laryngeal muscles. So intrinsic laryngeal muscles are 5. The posterior cricoarytenoid, which is the only abductor, meaning it's the only one that opens up the vocal folds. The adductors, which involve the lateral cricoarytenoid and the interarytenoids. Those are two muscles that actually aid in bringing the vocal folds together. And then we have the thyroarytenoids, which involves two parts, the thyrovocalis and the thyromuscularis, which have points of attachment to the thyroid and the arytenoid cartilage. The thyrovocalis might act as an adductor, bringing the vocal folds together, but its main job is to either increase the tension of the vocal folds or relax the vocal folds and decrease the pitch, which is the job of the thyromuscularis. Now, all of these muscles that I talked about, the interarytenoids, the LCA, lateral cricoarytenoid, the posterior cricoarytenoid, and the thyroarytenoids, they're all supplied by a nerve called the recurrent laryngeal nerve, RLN in short, the recurrent laryngeal nerve. It's a branch of the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve is cranial nerve 10. Okay. So if I say it again, PCA, LCA, IA, and TA, thyroarytenoids, all of these 4 intrinsic laryngeal muscles are supplied by the recurrent laryngeal nerve, RLN, a branch of the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. The only muscle that is supplied by the superior laryngeal nerve, SLN, is the cricothyroid. Okay, and that is involved in tensing or increasing the pitch of our voice.